When Kwame's beloved wife Aisha dies suddenly, his world falls apart. But his grief turns into obsession when he discovers an ancient wooden figurine among her belongings, one that begins to whisper to him in the dead of night. Convinced it's Aisha's spirit reaching out from beyond, Kwame clings to the mysterious statue, desperate to reunite with the love he lost. But as the whispers grow darker and demand more sinister acts, Kwame finds himself trapped in a web of supernatural terror. Is it truly Aisha calling to him, or has he unleashed something far more malevolent? With his sanity slipping and the villagers fearful of the dark presence surrounding him, Kwame must confront the chilling truth before it consumes him entirely. A gripping tale of love, loss, and the dangers of clinging to the past, the haunting embrace will pull you into a world where devotion can blur the line between life and death and awaken forces best left undisturbed. Will Kwame find the strength to let go, or will he lose himself to the darkness? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The sun dipped low over the quiet village of Anansi, casting a warm golden glow on the thatched roofs that dotted the landscape. The air was thick with the scent of evening fires, where families prepared their dinners, and the distant laughter of children echoed through the narrow, winding paths. But amidst the bustle of village life, the rhythmic clang of a hammer striking metal rang out, drowning out all other sounds. In his modest workshop, Kwame, the village blacksmith, worked tirelessly, his muscled arms moving with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime at the forge. Sparks danced in the twilight as he hammered a glowing piece of iron into shape. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but his thoughts were far from his work. They were with her Aisha. She had been his everything, the light that turned his small clay house into a home. With her, the world seemed brighter, simpler, filled with a joy that nothing could dim. Her laughter had been the sweetest music he knew, and her warm embrace the only comfort he ever needed after a long day of labor. Each evening, as the sun set and the village prepared for nightfall, Kwame would return home to the welcoming arms of his wife, where they would share stories, laughter, and simple meals together. But tonight, there was no welcoming embrace waiting for him. Aisha had been taken from him far too soon. Just 3 weeks ago, a mysterious fever had swept over her, a cruel sickness that came without warning. At first, it had seemed like a simple ailment, something that could be treated with the herbal remedies the villagers had relied on for generations. But as the days turned to nights, and the nights back into days, the fever did not relent. It drained the life from her eyes, stole the strength from her limbs, and left her gasping for breath as Kwame watched helplessly. Desperation had driven him to seek the wisdom of the village elder, Nana, a woman known for her knowledge of ancient remedies and prayers. Nana had performed every ritual she knew, burning herbs and chanting incantations that were said to drive away evil spirits. But it had been in vain. No prayer, no potion, no whispered plea could save her. And so, just 2 days ago, the villagers had gathered under the great baobab tree to say their final goodbyes. They had sung the ancient songs, the ones meant to guide a lost soul to the afterlife, their voices rising and falling like the wind. But Kwame had stood apart, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart unwilling to let go. To him, the funeral was a mockery, a cruel confirmation of something he could not bring himself to accept. He couldn't believe she was gone. How could she be, when he still felt her presence in the small house they had shared? When he still smelled her scent in the linens, still heard her soft laughter echoing in his mind? It was as though Aisha was just out of reach, hiding somewhere in the shadows, waiting for him to find her. Tonight, the village seemed quieter than usual, as if it, too, was mourning the loss of Aisha's light. Kwame stood in the doorway of their darkened home, staring out into the dusk. The shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, creeping closer as the sun dipped below the horizon. For a moment, he allowed himself to pretend that everything was as it had been before. He imagined Aisha sitting by the fire, her delicate hands busy preparing their evening meal, her eyes glimmering with that warmth he loved so dearly. But when he turned around, the house was cold and empty. Kwame let out a shaky breath, the weight of his sorrow pressing heavily on his chest. The villagers had told him it was time to move on, to let her go and return to the life he once had. But they did not understand. They couldn't feel the void that Aisha's absence had left in his soul. Each night since her passing, he had slept alone in their bed, the emptiness beside him a constant reminder that she was truly gone. Tonight, as he settled into bed, he reached out to the spot where Aisha would have been. His fingers touched only the cool fabric of the sheets. In the darkness, he closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would bring him dreams of her, that in his dreams he might find some semblance of the peace that had been stolen from him. But instead of dreams, the silence of the night was broken by a faint sound, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. Kwame's eyes snapped open, his heart quickening. He strained his ears, listening, but the whisper was gone. He sat up, his eyes scanning the shadows that filled the corners of the room. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of something just beyond the edge of his vision. But when he blinked, there was nothing there. Only darkness and silence. "It's just the wind," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But his heart refused to slow. There had been something in that whisper, something that felt familiar. Kwame lay back down, pulling the thin blanket over himself. But as he closed his eyes once more, a single thought gnawed at the back of his mind. What if Aisha was trying to reach him? What if she was not truly gone? In his grief, he had heard the stories of those who had spoken to their loved ones beyond the grave. Stories of ancient rituals that could bring a spirit back, if only for a moment. He had dismissed them as mere superstition, tales meant to comfort those too weak to face the finality of death. But tonight, as he lay in the darkness, the whisper returned. This time, it was unmistakable, a faint, breathy sound, like a voice carried on the wind. And this time, it spoke his name. Kwame. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. "Aisha," he whispered into the darkness. There was no response, only the soft rustle of the wind against the thatched roof. But Kwame could not shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. That somehow, in some way, Aisha was reaching out to him. A spark of hope flickered in his chest, a dangerous thing that could either save him or doom him. He did not know which. But as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought consumed him: he would find a way to bring her back, no matter the cost. Little did he know, the cost would be higher than he could ever imagine. The first light of dawn spilled through the cracks in the wooden shutters, casting faint beams across the clay walls of Kwame's home. He lay motionless in bed, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling as the world around him slowly came to life. Outside, the sounds of the village waking up drifted through the thin walls, roosters crowing, children's laughter, and the distant thuds of hammers and axes. Yet, inside the house, a heavy silence lingered, as if it were frozen in time. Kwame's mind was clouded with the memory of the whispers he had heard the night before. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as he replayed that faint voice in his head, the one that had called his name so softly. Aisha's voice, or so he wanted to believe. But as the morning sun grew stronger, logic began to seep back into his thoughts. Perhaps it had been nothing more than a trick of his exhausted mind, a desperate illusion conjured by his grief. Rising from the bed, he glanced at the spot where she once slept beside him. The blankets were neatly folded, just as she had always kept them. But now it only served as a reminder of her absence. Kwame's hands trembled as he ran his fingers along the cool fabric, hoping to catch even the faintest trace of her warmth. But there was nothing, only the cold, unfeeling cloth beneath his touch. The morning light poured into the house, but it did little to lift the shadows that clung to Kwame's heart. He had no appetite, but he forced himself to drink a few sips of water, his throat dry from a night spent whispering into the darkness. He couldn't shake the thought that Aisha was trying to reach him, even if it defied all reason. The villagers had warned him about clinging too tightly to the past. After Aisha's funeral, his neighbors had come by daily to check on him, bringing food, company, and gentle words of comfort. But he had pushed them all away, retreating deeper into the solitude of his grief. In time, even his closest friends had stopped knocking on his door. Now, the only visitors he received were shadows and whispers. As he moved through the house, Kwame's gaze settled on the old wooden cabinet that stood in the corner of their bedroom. He had avoided opening it ever since Aisha's death, knowing that it held her most cherished belongings. Today, something pulled him toward it, a quiet urge he couldn't quite explain. The cabinet creaked as he opened its doors, revealing a collection of folded linens, old clothes, and trinkets. Among the neatly arranged items was a small box that he had almost forgotten about, a carved wooden chest that Aisha had treasured. The carvings along the edges were intricate and worn, depicting symbols and patterns that Kwame did not recognize. He hesitated, a sense of unease creeping over him. It felt wrong to open it, as if doing so would disturb something that was better left alone. But the whisper from last night still echoed in his mind, urging him on. Slowly, he opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft, faded cloth, was a small figurine carved from dark wood. It was no larger than his hand, but its craftsmanship was exquisite. The figure depicted a woman with her arms outstretched, her face frozen in a serene expression. Kwame's breath caught in his throat. He had seen Aisha holding this figure before, often in moments of quiet reflection, but he had never thought much of it. Now, as he held it in his hands, he felt a strange warmth radiating from the wood, as if it were alive. He could almost imagine that it was pulsing with a faint heartbeat. His mind raced, remembering the stories Aisha had once told him of her ancestors, stories of spirits trapped in objects, waiting to be released. He had laughed them off then, thinking them nothing more than superstitions. But now, standing in the cold emptiness of his home, he was no longer sure. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that the faint whisper he had heard the previous night had come from the direction of the cabinet, right where this figurine had been hidden. Could it be that Aisha's spirit had somehow found its way into this wooden statue? The thought was absurd, yet he could not shake it. Cradling the figurine in his hands, Kwame returned to the bed and set it gently on the pillow where Aisha once slept. For a moment, he simply stared at it, willing it to move, to give him some sign that she was truly there. But the figurine remained still, its wooden eyes staring back at him, unblinking. As the day wore on, Kwame found himself unable to leave the house. The villagers went about their daily routines outside, but he was trapped in a world of his own making, his thoughts consumed by the whisper that had called his name. He tried to distract himself with chores, sharpening tools, sweeping the floors, but every task felt meaningless without Aisha by his side. Night fell quickly, the shadows creeping back into the corners of his home. As he prepared for bed, Kwame hesitated, his eyes once again drawn to the figurine resting on the pillow. What if he was not imagining things? What if Aisha was truly reaching out to him through this object? He couldn't bear the thought of losing her twice. As he lay down, he pulled the figurine close, clutching it against his chest like a lifeline. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes one's own breathing sound unnaturally loud. But as Kwame's eyes drifted shut, he heard it again, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Kwame. His eyes snapped open. The voice was closer now, clearer. It wasn't just in his head, it was coming from the figurine in his arms. His heart pounded as he sat up, the room spinning around him. Aisha? He whispered, his voice barely audible. The whisper came again, more insistent this time, sending a shiver down his spine. I am here. Kwame's breath hitched in his throat. It was her voice. It had to be. The warmth of the figurine seemed to seep into his skin, and for a fleeting moment, he felt her presence, as if she were truly there, wrapped in his arms. But as he clung to the figurine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The warmth that had once been comforting now felt suffocating, and the whisper carried an undertone that he had not noticed before, a hint of something cold, something hungry. He tried to pull away, but his hands would not release their grip on the statue. The whisper grew louder, filling his mind, and for the first time, Kwame felt a flicker of fear. What had he brought into his home? The answer would come sooner than he was prepared for, and it would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the thin line between devotion and madness. The moon hung high in the midnight sky, casting pale silver light through the small cracks in the walls of Kwame's modest home. The village of Anansi was quiet now, the sounds of laughter, crackling fires, and whispered conversations long faded into silence. But inside Kwame's house, the night was far from peaceful. Kwame lay on his side, staring into the darkness, the carved wooden figurine resting on the pillow beside him. It had been 3 days since he first heard the whispers, and each night they had grown louder, clearer. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. But now, they were unmistakable, words carried on a cold breath that caressed his ear. Tonight, the voice was stronger than ever. Kwame, the whisper came, low and soft, sending a shiver down his spine. He turned slowly toward the figurine, his heart hammering in his chest. The moonlight spilled over its smooth surface, making the carved eyes seem to glimmer with a life of their own. "Aisha, is that you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. There was a pause, a silence so deep that Kwame could hear his own heartbeat. Then, the voice came again, softer this time, almost mournful. "Yes, it is I, my love." Kwame's breath hitched, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. Could it really be her? Was his beloved wife truly reaching out to him from beyond the grave? He had heard the elders speak of spirits trapped between worlds, of souls unable to move on. Perhaps Aisha was one of them, her spirit tethered to the earthly realm, seeking a way to return to him. "Tell me what to do," he pleaded, clutching the figurine tighter. "How can I bring you back?" The whisper grew stronger, carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "I am cold, Kwame, so cold. I need your warmth, your love. Bring me the herbs from the forest, the ones with red berries, and mix them with blood." Kwame stiffened, his mind racing. The red-berried herbs she spoke of were known to the villagers. They were used in rituals, ones that few dared to perform. The elders warned that such herbs were tied to powerful, dark forces. But if this was truly Aisha speaking to him, he could not refuse her. He had already lost her once. He would not fail her again. "I'll do it," he whispered fiercely. "I'll get the herbs, whatever it takes." The whisper softened, a sigh of relief in its tone. "Hurry, my love, the full moon draws near. And with it, the door to the spirit world will open." Kwame nodded, though his mind was clouded with doubt. He did not know much about the ancient rituals of the ancestors, but he remembered hearing the villagers speak in hushed tones about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond one's understanding. The full moon was believed to be a time when the veil between worlds was thin, a moment when spirits could cross over. If he could bring Aisha back, it had to be now. The next morning, Kwame left his home early, before the sun had fully risen. The village was still shrouded in mist as he made his way toward the dense forest that bordered Anansi. The air was crisp, each breath a reminder that time was running out. He knew the herbs he needed grew deep in the forest, in a secluded area that the villagers avoided. Legends spoke of dark creatures that roamed those woods, spirits that guarded the sacred plants. But Kwame's resolve was stronger than his fear. If there was even a chance he could bring Aisha back, he would face whatever danger awaited him. As he pushed deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around him, their twisted branches blocking out the sun. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The deeper he ventured, the more the world seemed to change. The cheerful chirping of birds gave way to an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Kwame's heart raced as he searched, his eyes scanning the ground for the telltale signs of the herbs he sought. Finally, in a small clearing bathed in moonlight, he found them, red-berried shrubs growing in a tight cluster. The sight filled him with a strange mixture of relief and dread. He reached out, plucking the herbs carefully, his hands trembling with a combination of excitement and fear. As he turned to leave, he heard it again, a whisper, but this time, it was not the soft, familiar voice of Aisha. It was something darker, harsher, like the hiss of a serpent. "Fool, you do not know what you awaken." Kwame spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one there. Only the shadows of the forest, shifting and writhing as if alive. His breath quickened, panic clawing at his mind. Was it just his imagination, or was there truly something lurking in the darkness? Clutching the herbs to his chest, he ran. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees reaching out with twisted limbs as if trying to hold him back. By the time he burst through the edge of the woods and into the open fields that led back to the village, his clothes were torn, his face streaked with sweat and mud. That night, Kwame sat in his dimly lit home, the herbs spread out before him. The figurine sat on the table, its wooden eyes seeming to watch his every move. He mixed the herbs with a small bowl of water, just as the voice had instructed, and added a single drop of his own blood. The liquid turned a deep, unnatural red, the color of freshly spilled wine. Holding his breath, Kwame dipped a small piece of cloth into the potion and pressed it against the figurine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the wood seemed to absorb the liquid, darkening as if it were drinking in his offering. "Aisha, I did as you asked," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The air around him grew colder, the shadows deepening until they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The whisper returned, clearer than ever before, but it was no longer the gentle voice he had once known. It was sharper now, filled with hunger. "You have done well, my love, but it is not enough. I need more. Much more." Kwame's heart sank. The voice was different now, less like Aisha's and more like something wearing her voice like a mask. But he could not turn back. He had come too far, risked too much. If this was truly the path to bringing her back, he would see it through, no matter the cost. As the last light of the day faded, leaving the village cloaked in darkness, Kwame felt a chill settle into his bones. He realized with a sudden clarity that whatever he had awakened, it was not Aisha. At least, not the Aisha he had known. But it was too late to stop. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, and something deep inside him knew that once the ritual began, it could not be undone. The full moon was only a night away, and with it would come the final test. The sun rose slowly over the village of Anansi, casting a soft, golden light across the dew-soaked fields. But for Kwame, the new day brought no comfort. The whispers had haunted him through the night, a constant murmur that seeped into his dreams, twisting them into nightmares filled with shadowy figures and voices that mocked his grief. As he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he knew that whatever he had awakened was far from the loving spirit of his wife. He could still feel the cold touch of the figurine against his chest, the way it seemed to pulse with a life of its own after he had performed the ritual. The voice had grown sharper, more demanding, and though it still used Aisha's name, Kwame could no longer ignore the nagging doubt that gnawed at his heart. Had he truly brought her back? Or had he opened a door that should have remained shut? Rising from his bed, he decided that he could no longer face this alone. He needed guidance, and there was only one person in the village who might have the wisdom he needed, Nana, the village elder. As Kwame stepped out of his house, the villagers greeted him with cautious smiles, their eyes filled with unspoken concern. They had noticed his strange behavior over the past few days, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he muttered to himself as if speaking to someone unseen. But no one dared to question him openly. Grief was a powerful force, and everyone knew that a man could be driven to madness by the loss of a loved one. The air was thick with the scent of morning fires as Kwame made his way to Nana's home, a small hut on the edge of the village. The elder woman was known for her knowledge of the old ways, the rituals and secrets passed down through generations. If anyone could help him understand what he had unleashed, it would be her. Nana was sitting outside her hut, tending to a small garden of medicinal herbs when Kwame approached. She was a frail woman with a back curved by age, but her eyes were sharp, glinting like the edge of a blade. She looked up as he approached, her wrinkled face breaking into a gentle smile. "Kwame, my son," she said, her voice soft but filled with a strength that belied her years. "What brings you here so early? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Kwame hesitated, unsure of where to begin. How could he explain the whispers, the strange warmth of the figurine, and the voice that claimed to be Aisha? But Nana's eyes were patient, and he found himself pouring out the story, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. When he finished, the smile had faded from Nana's face. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, and then she sighed, a deep, weary sound. "You are playing with forces you do not understand, Kwame," she said quietly. "The herbs you used, the blood you spilled, these are not things to be taken lightly. The full moon is a time of power, yes, but it is also a time when the veil between our world and the spirit realm is at its thinnest. You have invited something into your home, but whether it is truly your wife's spirit, I cannot say." Kwame's heart sank. He had hoped that Nana would have the answers he so desperately needed, but instead, her words only deepened his fears. "But the voice, it sounds like her. It knows things only Aisha would know," he insisted, his voice rising with desperation. Nana shook her head slowly. "Spirits are not always what they seem. Some are benevolent, but others are tricksters, feeding on the pain and desires of the living. They can take on the voices and memories of those we love, using them to ensnare us." Kwame's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Then what am I supposed to do? How can I know if it's truly her?" Nana rose slowly, her joints creaking, and gestured for Kwame to follow her into her hut. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and herbs hanging from the rafters. She moved with purpose to a small, dusty shelf lined with old scrolls and jars filled with strange powders. "There is a way," she said, her voice low and serious. "But it is dangerous. If you truly wish to know whether the spirit is your wife, you must confront it directly. Draw it out under the light of the full moon, when it is at its most powerful. But be warned, Kwame, if it is not truly Aisha, it may try to deceive you, or worse, consume you." Kwame's throat tightened. The idea of facing whatever was lurking in his home filled him with dread, but he could not turn back now. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Nana handed him a small pouch filled with a dark, powdery substance. "Burn this incense in your home tonight. It will draw the spirit out into the open, forcing it to reveal its true form. But you must be strong, Kwame. Do not let it play on your emotions, no matter what it says." Kwame nodded, his hands shaking as he took the pouch. "Thank you, Nana," he said, his voice hoarse. "I will do as you say." As he turned to leave, Nana reached out and grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "One more thing, Kwame," she said, her eyes piercing into his. "If the spirit is not your wife, you must be prepared to destroy it. No matter how much it looks or sounds like Aisha, it is not her. Do you understand?" Kwame swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He nodded, unable to trust himself to speak. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kwame returned to his home. The village was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. He could feel the weight of the full moon pressing down on him, its pale light casting long shadows across the ground. Inside his home, the figurine sat on the table, exactly where he had left it. But now it seemed different, its wooden eyes glimmering with a light that hadn't been there before. Kwame's heart pounded as he prepared the incense, his hands moving with the nervous energy of a man who knew he was on the brink of something that could not be undone. As he lit the incense, a thick, acrid smoke filled the room. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder, more insistent, as if whatever was inside the figurine knew what was coming. "Kwame, please, don't do this," the voice pleaded, sounding so much like Aisha that his resolve wavered. But Nana's warning echoed in his mind, and he steeled himself. "I need to know the truth," he muttered, his eyes never leaving the figurine. "If you are truly Aisha, show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, coalescing into a shape that was both familiar and terrifying. The figure that emerged was not quite Aisha, but a grotesque mimicry of her, its eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. Kwame's heart clenched with both hope and horror as he took a step back. He had his answer, but it was not the one he had been praying for. Whatever stood before him was not his wife. It was something far darker, and it was hungry. The full moon would reach its peak soon, and with it, the final confrontation that would decide whether Kwame would be able to break free from the nightmare he had unwittingly unleashed. The moon hung high in the night sky, a brilliant silver disk that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly glow. The village of Anansi lay quiet, cloaked in shadows, but inside Kwame's small home, a storm of fear and determination raged. The acrid scent of burning incense filled the air, the smoke swirling like a living thing around the dimly lit room. Kwame's eyes were locked on the grotesque figure that had emerged from the shadows. It stood in the center of the room, its form flickering like a dying flame, its face a twisted mockery of Aisha's once beautiful features. The thing that wore her face smiled at him, but the smile was cold, devoid of the warmth he had once known. "Kwame, my love," it whispered, its voice soft and melodic, yet carrying an edge that sent chills down his spine. "You brought me back, you did it. I am here, just as you wished." For a moment, Kwame's resolve wavered. The voice was so close to Aisha's, the way it caressed his name, the way it pleaded for him. But Nana's words echoed in his mind. Spirits are not always what they seem. Some are tricksters, feeding on the pain and desires of the living. His grip tightened on the pouch of incense in his hands, his knuckles white. "If you are truly Aisha, prove it," he demanded, his voice wavering despite his best efforts to sound strong. "Tell me something only she would know." The spirit hesitated, its eyes flickering with a faint light that seemed to pulse in time with the pounding of Kwame's heart. Then, it leaned closer, the shadows around it writhing like serpents. "Remember our first night by the river?" it whispered, a coy smile playing on its lips. "You told me you would carve my name into the tallest tree so that we would be together forever." Kwame's heart twisted painfully. That had been a secret moment, a promise made under the cover of darkness, far from the prying eyes of the village. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not even his closest friends. How could this spirit know such an intimate detail? But something still felt wrong. The way the spirit's eyes glimmered, the way its voice seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if struggling to maintain the illusion. The real Aisha's voice had been soft and soothing, a balm to his soul. This voice, though similar, carried a sinister undertone, like a wolf trying to mimic a sheep's bleat. "Why are you so cold?" Kwame asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Aisha was warm, full of life. "But you feel like death." The spirit's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing. "I have been gone for so long, Kwame. I am weak. I need more from you, more to sustain me," it hissed, its voice taking on a darker, more desperate tone. "You must finish the ritual, only then can I truly return to you." Kwame's hands shook as he reached for the ceremonial knife that lay on the table beside him. The spirit's eyes followed the movement, a hungry gleam flashing in its depths. The instructions it had given him were clear. He needed to mix the herbs with more blood under the light of the full moon. Only then could he bring Aisha back completely, or so it claimed. But as Kwame stared at the knife, a cold dread seeped into his bones. Was this truly the path to reuniting with his wife, or was he about to fall deeper into the clutches of a malevolent force that sought only to consume him? Nana's warning echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the price of tampering with forces beyond his understanding. The spirit stepped closer, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. "Do it, Kwame," it urged, its voice now a harsh whisper. "Give me what I need, and we will be together forever." Kwame hesitated, his eyes darting between the knife in his hand and the creature that wore his wife's face. His heart was a battleground of hope and fear. He had come so far, risked so much. Could he truly turn back now? But the hunger in the spirit's eyes, The way it seemed to grow stronger with each moment sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. Taking a deep breath, he turned away from the spirit, his resolve hardening. "No," he said, his voice stronger this time. "If you are truly Aisha, then you would never ask this of me." A shriek of rage filled the air, so loud that it made his ears ring. The spirit's serene mask twisted into a grotesque snarl, its eyes blazing with fury. "You fool!" it screamed, its voice a cacophony of overlapping whispers, each more twisted than the last. "You brought me here, and now you will finish what you started." The shadows in the room surged, wrapping around Kwame like tendrils. He struggled against them, the knife slipping from his grasp as he was thrown to the ground. The spirit loomed over him, its face shifting and warping, no longer resembling Aisha, but something far more monstrous. Kwame's vision blurred as the tendrils tightened, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Desperation fueled his movements as he reached for the pouch of incense Nana had given him. His fingers closed around it, and with the last of his strength, he threw the contents into the air. The room erupted in a burst of acrid smoke, the scent so strong that it made Kwame's eyes water. The spirit shrieked again, a sound that seemed to pierce through his very soul. The shadows that bound him loosened their grip, and Kwame scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. The spirit thrashed within the smoke, its form flickering wildly as if caught in a storm. "You think this will stop me?" it howled, its voice warping into something inhuman. "You cannot banish me. I am bound to your grief, your foolish hope." Kwame stumbled backward, his heart racing. He watched as the figure that had once worn Aisha's face dissolved into a writhing mass of darkness, its shape contorting as if trying to escape the confines of the smoke. For a moment, he thought it might disappear, that he had driven it away. But then, it began to reform, the darkness coalescing into a shape that was even more grotesque than before. It no longer looked anything like Aisha. Instead, it was a monstrous parody of her, its eyes glowing with a ravenous light. Kwame's hands shook as he backed toward the door. He had failed. The spirit was not Aisha, and now he had given it more power than ever. The full moon was nearly at its peak, and whatever ritual he had begun was far from over. He had one last chance to stop this. But it would require a sacrifice greater than he could have imagined, a sacrifice that would force him to confront the darkness in his own soul. With the spirit shrieking behind him, Kwame fled into the night, the moonlight casting long, twisted shadows as he raced toward the village elder's hut. Time was running out, and the final confrontation was drawing ever closer. The cold night air stung Kwame's face as he sprinted through the moonlit village, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the enraged shrieks of the spirit echoed through the stillness, growing fainter as he put distance between himself and the nightmare that had once worn Aisha's face. His legs ached, but he pushed himself onward, his only thought to reach Nana's hut before it was too late. The villagers had already retreated into their homes, the flicker of lanterns extinguished as they prepared for the long night. Kwame's frantic footsteps were the only sound in the narrow streets, the eerie silence pressing in on him like a physical weight. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. He finally reached Nana's hut, the scent of burning herbs wafting through the open door. He burst inside, nearly collapsing as the tension in his muscles released all at once. Nana was there, seated by her hearth, her sharp eyes watching him with a mixture of concern and understanding. She did not seem surprised to see him, as if she had known all along that he would return. "Nana," Kwame gasped, clutching his side as he struggled to catch his breath. "The spirit, it's not Aisha. It's something else, something monstrous. I don't know how to stop it." Nana nodded slowly, her expression grave. She gestured for him to sit, and he did, sinking onto a woven mat beside the fire. The warmth was a welcome relief, but it did little to thaw the icy fear that gripped his heart. "I warned you, Kwame," Nana said quietly, her voice steady despite the urgency of the moment. "You have invited a dark spirit into this world, one that feeds on your grief and desperation. It has used Aisha's voice, her memories, to lure you deeper into its trap. Kwame buried his face in his hands, the weight of his mistakes crashing over him like a wave. "I just wanted her back," he whispered, his voice cracking. I thought if I could bring her back, I wouldn't have to be alone." Nana's gaze softened, but there was no pity in her eyes, only a quiet resolve. "Love can be a powerful force, Kwame, but it can also blind us to the truth. The spirit has taken root in your soul, and it will not release you easily. The more you resist, the stronger it becomes." Kwame looked up, his eyes desperate. "What can I do? How do I stop it?" Nana rose slowly, her old bones creaking, and shuffled to a corner of her hut. She retrieved an ancient, weathered scroll from a high shelf and unfurled it on the floor before him. The parchment was covered in faded symbols and diagrams, the meaning of which was lost to Kwame. "This is an exorcism ritual," Nana explained, her voice low. "It is one of the oldest known to our people, passed down through generations. It can sever the bond between you and the spirit, but it is not without risk. The spirit will not go quietly." Kwame's hands trembled as he traced the lines on the scroll. "What do I need to do?" he asked, steeling himself for whatever horrors lay ahead. "You must confront the spirit in the place where it was awakened, the very spot where you performed the ritual with the herbs and blood," Nana said. "The full moon will reach its zenith soon, and that is when the spirit will be at its most powerful, but also its most vulnerable." Nana handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a piece of blessed charcoal and a bone knife inscribed with ancient runes. "Draw a circle around yourself with the charcoal," she instructed. "It will protect you from the spirit's influence. When it reveals its true form, use the knife to sever its connection to this world. But be warned, Kwame, if you falter, it will consume your soul." Kwame's throat tightened. The thought of facing the spirit again, knowing now what it truly was, filled him with dread. But he had no choice. This was his only chance to rid himself of the darkness that had taken hold of his life. "Thank you, Nana," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will do as you say." As he turned to leave, Nana reached out and placed a weathered hand on his arm. "Remember, Kwame," she said softly, her eyes piercing into his. "The spirit will use every trick it knows to break you. It will take the form of your wife, speak to you with her voice, and prey on your deepest fears. But it is not Aisha. You must not believe its lies." Kwame nodded, swallowing hard. He had already been fooled once, but he would not be deceived again. He could not afford to be. The journey back to his home was fraught with tension. The moon had risen higher in the sky, its silver light bathing the village in an otherworldly glow. Shadows danced along the narrow pathways, shifting and twisting as if alive. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind sent shivers down Kwame's spine, but he pressed on, clutching the bundle that Nana had given him as if it were a lifeline. When he reached his home, the air was thick with a suffocating darkness. The front door hung ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the wind. A sense of dread washed over him as he stepped inside. The once familiar space was now unrecognizable, the shadows writhing like living things, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The figurine sat in the center of the room, its wooden eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, a palpable force that pressed against Kwame's mind, trying to worm its way into his thoughts. "Kwame, you've returned," the spirit crooned, its voice a sickening parody of Aisha's. "I knew you couldn't stay away." Kwame ignored the taunts, his hands shaking as he knelt on the ground and began to draw a circle with the blessed charcoal. The spirit's laughter echoed in his ears, growing louder, more frenzied, as it realized what he was attempting to do. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed, its voice shifting into a guttural growl. "You are nothing without me, Kwame. Without your precious Aisha, you are lost." The circle complete, Kwame stood within it, clutching the bone knife. The spirit's form began to shift and distort, its once beautiful face melting into a grotesque mask of rage and hunger. The whispers grew to a cacophony, filling the room with a sound that made Kwame's ears ring. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Kwame raised the knife. "You are not Aisha," he shouted, his voice breaking. You are nothing but a monster wearing her face." The spirit lunged at him, but it was stopped short by the invisible barrier of the circle. It howled in fury, its form flickering and distorting as it thrashed against the boundary. With a steady hand, Kwame plunged the knife into the center of the circle, severing the connection between the spirit and the mortal world. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final, ear-splitting shriek, the spirit dissolved into a cloud of darkness, its form scattering like ashes in the wind. Kwame collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The room was silent now, the oppressive weight lifted. He had done it. The spirit was gone. But as the first light of dawn crept through the window, he could not shake the hollow ache in his heart. Aisha was truly gone, and now he was alone. But for the first time in weeks, the silence brought him peace. The shadows no longer whispered his name. Kwame awoke to the first light of dawn filtering through the cracks in his thatched roof, the room filled with a dim, gray light. For the first time in weeks, his home was silent. No whispers, no cold breath against his ear, no shadows twisting and writhing in the corners. The spirit was gone. He had banished it, severed its hold on him, yet, as he lay on the cold, hard floor, he could not shake the gnawing emptiness that had taken its place. Aisha was truly gone. There was no denying it now. The thing that had worn her face, that had whispered in her voice, was nothing more than a cruel illusion, a parasite that had fed on his grief and desperation. But in his heart, Kwame felt no relief, only an aching void where hope had once been. Rising slowly, he winced at the pain that shot through his muscles. His entire body ached, as if he had been fighting for days rather than hours. The room was a mess, the remnants of the ritual circle, the scattered herbs, and the ashes of the incense lay strewn about like the aftermath of a storm. Kwame stared at the wreckage, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. He had won, but at what cost? Steadying himself, he stumbled to the small wash basin by the window and splashed cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the remnants of the night's horrors. But as he gazed into the cracked mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. His eyes were sunken, his face gaunt, shadows clinging to his hollow cheeks like stains that would not wash away. "You did what you had to," he muttered to himself, gripping the edges of the basin so hard his knuckles turned white. "You had no choice." But deep down, a whisper of doubt gnawed at him. Had he truly freed himself from the spirit, or had he simply invited a new kind of darkness into his life? That night, exhaustion finally overtook him. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to collapse onto his bed, hoping that sleep would bring him the escape he so desperately craved. But instead of the dreamless slumber he longed for, he was plunged into a world far more terrifying than the one he had just escaped. The dreams began softly, a hazy swirl of memories that floated through his mind like drifting leaves. He saw Aisha, her laughter bright and clear as they walked by the river. He felt the warmth of her hand in his, the softness of her smile as she leaned into him. For a moment, he allowed himself to sink into the dream, to savor the sweet illusion of her presence. But then, as if a curtain had been torn away, the dream twisted. The river turned black, the trees around them withered and gnarled. A cold wind swept through the scene, carrying with it a chorus of faint whispers that sent chills down Kwame's spine. He turned to look at Aisha, but she was no longer the radiant woman he remembered. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and cracked, like a porcelain doll left to decay. "Kwame," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You left me. You let me die." "No," Kwame cried, reaching for her, but his hands passed through her form as if she were made of mist. "I tried to save you. I did everything I could." The dream shifted again, and he found himself back in his darkened home, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs. The twisted spirit that had masqueraded as Aisha stood before him, its face a grotesque parody of his wife's, its eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. It lunged at him, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and Kwame screamed. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The moonlight streaming through the window cast long, twisted shadows across the floor, and for a moment, he could not tell if he was truly awake or still trapped in the nightmare. The air in his room felt heavy, suffocating, as if the darkness itself were alive and pressing in on him. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered, rubbing his hands over his face. But even as he tried to calm his racing thoughts, he could still hear the faint echo of Aisha's voice whispering his name. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, as if she had been standing right beside him, her cold fingers brushing against his skin. Kwame forced himself to his feet, pacing the small room in an attempt to shake off the lingering dread. But no matter how many times he reminded himself that it had only been a dream, he could not escape the feeling that something was still wrong, that the spirit had not truly been banished. The house felt different now, not empty, but waiting. Panic clawed at his mind, but he pushed it down, determined not to succumb to fear again. He had faced the spirit once. He could face whatever this was. But as the hours passed and sleep continued to elude him, the whispers began to return, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, then louder, until they filled his mind with a cacophony of overlapping voices. In desperation, Kwame threw open the door and fled into the night, the cold air biting at his skin. The village was eerily quiet, the only sound his labored breaths as he ran through the empty streets. He had no destination in mind, only the instinct to run, to escape the voices that haunted him. But no matter how far he ran, the whispers followed, their cold breath tickling the back of his neck, their cruel laughter echoing in his ears. It was as if the entire village had become a twisted labyrinth, the shadows stretching and shifting to keep him trapped. Finally, he stumbled into the open clearing by the river, the place where he and Aisha had once shared their happiest moments. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a ghostly light, and for a moment, he thought he saw her standing by the water's edge, her silhouette framed against the silver glow. "Aisha," he called out, his voice cracking. But as he approached, the figure dissolved into mist, leaving nothing but the cold, empty air. Collapsing to his knees, Kwame buried his face in his hands, a broken sob escaping his lips. The spirit may have been banished, but it had left behind a scar on his soul, a darkness that he could not escape. The whispers, the dreams, the shadow of his own guilt, they were all pieces of a curse he could not shake. The dawn broke slowly, the first rays of sunlight casting a fragile warmth over the land. But for Kwame, the light brought no comfort. He was trapped in a waking nightmare, hunted by shadows that had taken root in his mind. And as he rose to his feet, his resolve hardened like iron. If he could not find peace, then he would find answers. There had to be a way to end this torment once and for all, to sever the ties that bound him to the darkness. And he would not stop until he found it, even if it meant venturing into places where no sane man would dare tread. The next step was clear. He would seek out the forbidden texts hidden deep in the forest shrine, where secrets older than the village itself lay waiting to be uncovered. There, in the heart of the darkness, he would face whatever was left of Aisha, or whatever had taken her place. The hunt for the truth had begun. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Kwame set off for the forest. His heart was a heavy drumbeat in his chest, the remnants of his haunted dreams still clinging to him like a shroud. He had made up his mind. If he was to end this nightmare, he needed to confront whatever dark force had entwined itself with his soul. The answer, he was certain, lay within the old shrine deep in the heart of the forest. The villagers rarely spoke of the shrine, and even fewer dared to venture there. It was said to be a place of ancient magic, where the boundary between the world of the living and the spirit realm was as thin as a spider's thread. Legends whispered that those who sought answers there often found more than they bargained for. But Kwame had no choice. The whispers in his mind were growing louder, the shadows darker, and if he didn't find a way to break free, he feared he would lose himself entirely. Clutching the bone knife Nana had given him and a small bundle of herbs for protection, he plunged into the dense forest, the underbrush crunching beneath his hurried steps. The forest was a maze of towering trees, their twisted branches reaching out like the gnarled hands of old men. The deeper he ventured, the darker it became, as if the sun itself was afraid to pierce the canopy above. Kwame's breath fogged in the cold morning air, and every rustle of leaves made him flinch. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, but he pushed forward, driven by a determination that had replaced his fear. After what felt like hours of walking, the trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing bathed in an eerie light. In its center stood the shrine, a crumbling structure made of dark stone, covered in moss and vines. It was older than any building in the village, its origins lost to time. The air around it was thick with a pungent scent, a mix of decay and something otherworldly. Kwame approached the shrine slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. The whispers that had plagued him for days were louder here, a chaotic chorus that seemed to be coming from the very stones of the structure. He took a deep breath and pulled out the bundle of herbs, lighting them with a small spark from his flint. The smoke filled the air, creating a protective barrier around him. "Whatever you are," he muttered under his breath, "I will not let you take me." The entrance to the shrine was a dark maw, beckoning him into its depths. With a final glance at the clearing behind him, Kwame stepped inside. The air immediately turned colder, and the sound of his footsteps echoed eerily in the narrow corridor. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to those on the scroll Nana had shown him, but older, more sinister. They seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. At the end of the corridor, he found a small chamber, lit by a strange, flickering glow that seemed to have no source. In the center of the room lay an altar, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. But it was what lay on the altar that made Kwame's breath catch in his throat. The carved wooden figurine, the same one he had used to summon Aisha's spirit, sat there, but it was different now. Its once smooth surface was cracked, its eyes hollow and filled with an unnatural light. It seemed to vibrate with energy, as if it were alive. "You've come back to me," a voice whispered from the darkness, sending a chill down Kwame's spine. It was Aisha's voice, but distorted, as if it were being dragged through a veil of shadows. Kwame gripped the bone knife tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "No more tricks. No more lies. I want the truth." The air in the chamber grew colder, the shadows thickening like a cloud of smoke. Slowly, the darkness coalesced into a shape, a figure that resembled Aisha, but was twisted, grotesque. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its smile was a hideous mockery of the warmth he had once known. "You brought me back, Kwame," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "You fed me with your grief, your despair. You made me strong." Kwame's heart clenched with both fear and fury. "You are not Aisha," he spat, his voice filled with more conviction than he felt. "You used her to get to me, to feed on my pain. But why? What are you?" The spirit's smile widened, its face warping and shifting as it moved closer. "I am what you made me," it hissed. "I am the darkness you called forth, the shadow of your own soul. You gave me life when you refused to let her go." Kwame took a step back, his mind racing. The words cut through him like a knife. Had he truly done this? Had his refusal to accept Aisha's death created this monstrous entity? He had clung to the hope of bringing her back, but in doing so, had he unleashed something far darker? "You're lying," Kwame said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his doubt. "You're just trying to break me." The spirit laughed, a sound like the grinding of bones. "Break you? No, Kwame. I am you. I am every whisper of doubt, every shadow of regret. You created me, and now I will consume you." Desperation surged through Kwame as the figure lunged at him, its claws outstretched. He slashed with the bone knife, the blade biting into the darkness, but it was like trying to cut through smoke. The spirit's laughter filled the chamber, a sound that reverberated inside his skull. "You cannot defeat me," it taunted, its form dissolving and reforming with every strike. "As long as you cling to your guilt, your regret, I will live on. You cannot kill what is already inside you." Kwame's mind raced, the realization hitting him like a blow to the chest. The spirit was feeding off his grief, his guilt. The more he fought it, the stronger it became. The only way to defeat it was to cut off its source of power, his own despair. Taking a deep breath, Kwame lowered the knife. "No more," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You are not real. You are nothing but the darkness I created, the pain I refuse to let go." The spirit faltered, its form flickering. "What are you doing?" it shrieked, the sickly light in its eyes dimming. "You cannot deny me." Kwame closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "I release you," he whispered. "I release the grief, the guilt, the regret. Aisha is gone, and I must let her go." A piercing scream filled the chamber as the spirit's form began to dissolve, the shadows writhing and shrieking as if they were being torn apart. The air grew warmer, the oppressive darkness lifting as the spirit's hold on him weakened. When Kwame opened his eyes, the chamber was empty. The figurine lay shattered on the altar, its power broken. The whispers in his mind had gone silent, replaced by a deep, aching stillness. He had done it. He had severed the bond. But as he stood alone in the quiet chamber, he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. He would have to return to a life without Aisha, to face the emptiness that her absence had left behind. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kwame took a deep breath, free from the weight that had once crushed him. The darkness was gone. Now he could begin to heal. With the first light of dawn breaking through the forest canopy, Kwame turned and walked out of the shrine, ready to face whatever the new day would bring. The first rays of dawn filtered through the thick canopy of the forest as Kwame emerged from the shrine, his heart lighter but his resolve tested. The oppressive darkness that had haunted him seemed to lift with each step he took away from that cursed place. But even as the sunlight warmed his skin, he could not shake the feeling that his battle was far from over. The forest, once a place of refuge for the villagers, now felt tainted, its ancient trees casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like grasping hands. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Kwame's grip on the bone knife tightened as he walked, each step filled with a quiet, cautious resolve. He had severed the spirit's connection, or so he thought. But the deeper he ventured into the forest on his way back to the village, the more he realized that something was still wrong. The whispers had gone silent, yet an unsettling pressure gnawed at the edges of his mind, like a splinter buried deep beneath the skin. It was a sensation he could not shake, a lingering darkness that refused to release its hold on him. Kwame paused by a small clearing, his breath fogging in the cool morning air. As he rested, trying to gather his strength, a sudden chill swept through the clearing, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to rise. The air seemed to thicken, and the shadows around him began to move, coalescing into a dark figure that materialized before him. It was the spirit. But this time, it did not take Aisha's form. It was a twisted, monstrous version of what it had once been, its shape constantly shifting and warping, like a shadow that refused to hold still. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent green light, filled with a rage that seemed to sear the very air around them. "You thought you could escape me, Kwame?" The spirit snarled, its voice a cacophony of overlapping whispers. "You think a mere ritual could sever the bond we share?" Kwame's heart pounded in his chest, but he did not back down. He had come too far to let fear consume him again. He raised the bone knife, its edge gleaming in the dim light. "You have no power over me anymore," he said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "I banished you. You have no place here." The spirit laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent chills down Kwame's spine. "Foolish mortal," it hissed. "You may have severed my bond to the figurine, but I am tied to you now. Your guilt, your grief, your fear, they are my lifeblood. You cannot rid yourself of me so easily." Kwame gritted his teeth, determination flaring in his chest. He had already defeated this monster once, driven it from his home. He could do it again. "I am done with you," he growled, taking a step forward. "You will not control me any longer." The spirit's form flickered, its laughter faltering for a brief moment. But then it lunged at him, its shadowy claws reaching for his throat. Kwame reacted on instinct, slashing with the bone knife. The blade passed through the spirit, tearing at the darkness, but it was like trying to cut through mist. The spirit shrieked in fury, but did not dissipate. Desperation clawed at Kwame's mind as he realized that brute force alone would not be enough. This creature was feeding on his emotions, growing stronger the more he fought it with anger and fear. It was not just a battle of flesh, but one of spirit of will. He remembered Nana's words, "The spirit feeds on your pain, your regret. The only way to defeat it is to starve it of what it craves." Taking a deep breath, Kwame lowered his knife and closed his eyes, letting the weapon fall to the ground. The spirit's laughter echoed around him, filled with triumph. Giving up so easily, it mocked, circling him like a vulture over a dying beast. "You're mine, Kwame. You cannot escape your own darkness." But Kwame was no longer listening. He stood still, focusing inward, searching for that flicker of peace he had felt when he let go of Aisha in the shrine. The spirit clawed at him, its icy tendrils trying to drag him down, but he refused to engage. Instead, he whispered to himself, a quiet mantra that he hoped would anchor him in the light. "I forgive myself," he murmured, the words shaky but growing stronger with each repetition. "I release the guilt, the pain. I release Aisha." The spirit screamed, its form flickering violently as if caught in a storm. It lunged again, but this time, its attacks passed through Kwame harmlessly, like a breeze through an open window. The darkness around him began to dissipate, unraveling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. "No," the spirit howled, its voice now desperate. "You cannot let go. You need me." But Kwame's resolve was like iron. He had made peace with the past, and he would not allow this creature to drag him back into the darkness. "I do not need you," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I am free." With a final, ear-piercing shriek, the spirit's form shattered, dissolving into a cloud of black mist that was swept away by the morning breeze. The forest around him seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifting as if a great curse had been broken. Kwame sank to his knees, exhaustion washing over him like a tidal wave. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer twisted and threatening. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world was quiet. He stayed there for a long moment, letting the stillness wash over him. When he finally rose, the sun was shining brightly, the forest filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The darkness had been defeated, not with violence, but with acceptance. He had faced his own demons, and in doing so, he had freed himself from their grasp. As he made his way back to the village, Kwame felt a sense of peace that he had not known since Aisha's death. The journey had been long, painful, and filled with loss, but it had also brought him something he never thought he would find again, a chance to start anew. When he reached the outskirts of the village, the familiar faces of his neighbors greeted him with cautious smiles. They had watched him fall apart, but now they saw a man who had found his way back from the brink. He did not need to explain what had happened in the forest, they saw it in his eyes. Nana stood at the edge of the crowd, her wise eyes shining with approval. As he approached, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Kwame," she said softly. "You found the strength within yourself." Kwame nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "I found my way back." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he truly believed it. The village of Anansi was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun as Kwame made his way home. The air was filled with the scent of burning firewood and the distant sounds of laughter as families gathered for their evening meals. It was a sight that once would have filled Kwame with a painful longing, but today it brought him a quiet sense of peace. The battle was over. He had faced the darkness, confronted his deepest fears, and emerged on the other side. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he no longer carried the weight of the shadows that had haunted him. The spirit that had tormented him was gone, and with it, the relentless whispers that had filled his nights with terror. As he walked through the village, he was greeted with smiles and nods of recognition. The villagers, who had once kept their distance, now welcomed him with warmth. They could see the change in him, the light that had returned to his eyes. He was no longer the broken man who had shut himself away in the darkness of his grief. Kwame paused by the great baobab tree at the center of the village, its ancient branches stretching toward the sky like a protector. He remembered standing there just weeks ago, during Aisha's funeral, filled with a sense of loss so profound it had nearly swallowed him whole. But now, as he looked up at the tree, he no longer felt that crushing weight. Instead, he felt a quiet resolve, a sense that he could honor Aisha's memory without being consumed by it. He turned and made his way toward the small house he had shared with Aisha. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, and he stepped inside. The familiar scent of herbs and wood smoke filled the air, bringing back memories of the life they had built together. But now, those memories no longer brought him pain. They were simply a part of who he was, a thread in the tapestry of his life. The house was quiet, the shadows soft and welcoming rather than oppressive. The space that had once felt like a tomb now felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could begin anew. He walked slowly through the rooms, his fingers trailing along the worn edges of the furniture, each piece holding a memory of Aisha. At the center of their bedroom stood the bed they had shared, the linen still neatly folded as if she might return at any moment. Kwame sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees, and closed his eyes. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember her as she had been, her laughter, her warmth, the way she had made even the darkest days seem bright. But as the memories washed over him, he felt something shift inside. It was as if a door had finally closed, not with a slam, but with a gentle, accepting click. Aisha was gone, and he would never see her again. But that was okay. She would always be a part of him, not as a ghost to haunt him, but as a light to guide him. With a deep breath, he stood up and walked to the small wooden chest that sat in the corner of the room. It was filled with Aisha's belongings, her favorite shawl, the carved comb she had used every morning, the small trinkets she had collected over the years. Carefully, Kwame gathered the items and carried them outside. The villagers watched in silence as he made his way to the edge of the river, where he and Aisha had shared so many of their happiest moments. The water sparkled in the fading light, the gentle current whispering secrets only the river knew. Kwame knelt by the water's edge and began placing the items one by one into the river, watching as the current carried them away. "This is for you, Aisha," he whispered, his voice steady. "I release you. I release the pain, the guilt, the regret. I carry your memory with me, but I will no longer be bound by it." As the last of her belongings disappeared into the river, a strange calm settled over him. It was as if the river had taken not just the physical items, but the last remnants of the darkness that had clung to his soul. He had let go, truly let go, and in doing so, he had found a freedom he had never thought possible. The villagers, who had been watching from a respectful distance, approached him quietly. One by one, they offered words of comfort and support, their hands resting on his shoulders, their smiles filled with understanding. In their eyes, Kwame saw not pity, but respect, a recognition of the strength it had taken to confront his demons and come out the other side. Nana was the last to approach. The old woman's eyes were filled with pride as she looked at him. "You did well, Kwame," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You faced the darkness and found your way back to the light." Kwame nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you, Nana," he replied. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." The elder nodded, her eyes twinkling. "The strength was always within you, Kwame. You just needed to find it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village, Kwame turned to face the future. There would be challenges ahead, he knew that. But for the first time in a long while, he was not afraid. The darkness that had once seemed so insurmountable had been defeated, not by force, but by acceptance, by the power of letting go. In the days that followed, Kwame began to rebuild his life. He reopened his blacksmith shop, his hands once again shaping metal with the skill and precision that had made him so respected in the village. The work brought him a sense of purpose, a way to reconnect with the world he had shut himself off from. And in quiet moments, when the village slept and the stars filled the sky, he would sit by the river and remember Aisha, not with sadness, but with gratitude for the time they had shared. The darkness was gone, but her light would always guide him forward.